Well, somebody that I've asked on, because he's given one of New Zealand's leading business leaders, worked in both the public and private sector, is regarded as the taumata, or one of the leaders of Otago's business school, Otago University's business school, but also has a wide range of experience in the public-private sector, including, interestingly, the diplomatic corps there for a wee while, is Craig Stobo. And he joins us now to talk about the budget. Craig, welcome to the show. Good morning to you.
Hello, Martin. How are you?
Good, mate. Yeah, I can hear you really well. Listen, tell Craig, did you watch the budget at all, or did you go?
I watched part of it on TV, but pretty much went straight to the website on the Treasury, rolled out all the documents. So I've been through quite a bit of detailed preparation for this morning's discussion with you. So yes, I can talk quite a lot about the budget. I've called it the iceberg budget, and the reason I'm calling it the iceberg budget is that the government's talking about what you see above the water, which is the half-price public transport for under 25s and free for 13s, and it's going to allow extra early child education, the abolition of $5 prescription payments, and the expanded winter home program, etc., plus $400 million for South Innovation Hubs. That's the stuff you see above the line, and it's reasonably hard for opposition parties to take pot shots at that stuff. It does mean $4.8 billion of new spending, but 80% of that relates to cost pressures because of the costs of labour obviously going up, and people want more money to roll out programs. But that's about 1% of GDP, still meaningful. But it's silent, and this is the stuff underneath the iceberg, or underneath the water, the iceberg underneath, which is they're silent on the bigger policy issues to add to the policy bonfire earlier in the year. So it's pretty silent on health reforms progress, polytech reform progress, and water reform progress. And there's been a lot of discussion on the news in the last 24, 48 hours on the economics of this. And I think what is interesting is comparing what we were told yesterday compared to what the Treasury pumped out in the half-year economic and fiscal update on December the 14th. So it's reasonably close. It's only 5 months ago. But at that time, they were predicting a recession of minus 0.3% GDP in 2024. In this budget, magically, it's disappeared. We're not having a recession anymore. We've got 1% growth. Now, that's extraordinary, and that's coming from a number of things, but it includes much stronger net migration, and obviously much stronger tourism. So there's no recession. Magically, the recession's disappeared. The CPI forecasts for the same period are still above where the RBNZ wants to be. The Treasury and the Finance Minister are looking at 3.3% CPI for 2024 now. That's still outside the RBNZ's range. And the cash position of the government's coffers is weakened considerably. So the operating balance is worsening from minus $0.5 billion in the half-year update in December to $7.6 billion negative in the budget, which is a residual cash balance problem of $10 billion extra cash that has to be funded. So we get no recession suddenly. We get a CPI not back in the 1 to 3% band, and we have pressure on short-term interest rates. Now, the RBNZ is coming out next week on the 24th of May with a monetary policy statement. This is a stimulatory budget, so it adds to economic growth. And the RBNZ would not, or may have been consulted about this, I don't know, but they'll be reading those tea leaves pretty carefully today in preparation for next week. So it just puts more pressure on the OCR, which sits at 5.25% today. It has to rise at least another 25 and perhaps 50 basis points next week, because the government's adding to economic growth and is contributing to an extension of the time period it will take for inflation to get back into 1 to 3% band. So that's what I call the iceberg budget. There's a little bit above the top that we see, and it's quite hard for the opposition parties to sort of take pot shots at that. The opposition parties have to get below the water and look at these longer-term trends and ask the questions, with an increased cash balance deficit problem, how do we cope with that in the out years? So in the government's funding program for next year, they're moving from $30 billion of government bond issuance to $34.5 billion, but also an increase in short-term bill issuance, so short-term funding going from $3 billion to $9 billion. That means next year we'll have government bonds outstanding of $168 billion, but that rises to $192 billion in 2027. That, if you divide that by the number of people living in New Zealand, we've got a $40,000 debt each because of public borrowing pressures. That's a lot more borrowing. So
it is.
This will come back. That will come back to hurt us in terms of interest rates, and that affects mortgages. It affects the cost of capital for business. It will affect employment. It will affect household incomes. It will be lower house prices. And the Standard & Poor's credit rating agency guys will be looking at this and saying, okay, we've got a current account deficit that was sitting above 8% of GDP. It's not improving dramatically. We've got a fiscal impulse, which is adding to debt. We'll watch this quite carefully, I suspect. Nothing's going to happen today. But they'll be thinking about the credit rating issues for our country. So you've got a short-term policy kind of lolly scramble, but the underlying fundamentals are deteriorating. And that has to be concerning to everyone interested in the long-term future of this country.
Okay, and I thank you for your analysis, and I think you're spot on. Can I ask a question of you, though? Is ironically Cyclone Gabriel and the recovery of it the stimulation package that the budget delivers? Might we not have headed into recession, but ironically, for this natural disaster in the Bay and the East Coast?
Well, there's a $10 billion increase in what they call the multi-cyclical investment program, and $6 billion of that is put towards Gabriel. You're right, and that's part of the funding task going forward. You're quite right, but also it's the unwinding of the large-scale asset program and the incorporation of Kāinga borrowing. Housing Corporation, the Kāinga borrowing is now part of government borrowing. It's not funding itself. So there are a number of reasons why that borrowing program goes up. But this has to be paid for. Now, interest costs are going to be the fourth largest part of our departmental vote expenditures very shortly, behind the majors, health, education, social policy. That's a lot of costs because of the much larger program and the much higher interest rates. So it's all coming home to this.
Well, but as you say, iceberg stuff. I have seen some analysis that backs you 100%, Craig, on this in the last 24 hours. But it certainly isn't a headline consideration, and it wasn't a fundamental part of how it was reported last night on either television news channel. You're concerned about it, but how do you concerned from a political point of view I'm sure you'll understand what I mean, ordinary people be? Those with a mortgage, couple of kids, just trying to make ends meet.
Yeah, well, let's just think about the mortgage rates, which are sitting at, 8% for floating at the moment if you get a mortgage from one of the major banks. If the OCRs move up another 25, 50 basis points, which puts pressure on floating mortgages, this just puts more pressure on households, and in particular for small businesses who use their homes as collateral for funding those businesses. Small business in this budget was not talked to at all. So does that mean longer hours that people have to work in their businesses, more mental stress? Does it mean that they cannot afford to pay those payments? So the cost of living pressures haven't gone away in terms of costs of living. They're not going away. And you have costs of funding homes and businesses that is going to rise. That's just seen from the road, plain as a nose on your face. So you asked me the question, what do the ordinary voter think? Well, if you're a borrower, it's not that great an outlook. If you're a depositor, it's fine. But all the headlines go to those who are borrowing money, and they're going to be hurting.
Craig, you've been around the business for a long time. You've worked in both public and private sector. But you've also been interested in politics, and both impact your jobs previously, both commercially and in terms of service, have impacted or been by politics, and obviously you've seen political effects. Do you think that there's a correlation between, in the mind of the average voter, at the mortgage rate that they pay and government policy, fiscal policy? Or do you think they think those bloody rapacious Australian banks?
People borrow money because they need it for a reason, so they have to make a decision, don't they? Ex ante, whether it's a good decision for whatever reason. So some people can't get cash at the moment because they don't qualify. So there's certainly demand. Banks are rationing because of they need to look after credit really carefully. So in their minds, I think what they're interested in is, can I get cash to fund something, and have I made the right decision, floating versus fixed, or is there another way of sorting out the funding issue rather than having to borrow or having to give up something else? So mortgages are really important in people's minds. Law and order is important in people's minds. Education and health are important in people's minds. So, the budget really didn't go to discuss how cost of living in those areas can really assist people. Overall, there's obviously some policy changes on early childhood education, etc., but largely people will be thinking, well, it's all very good to waive $5 prescription, but cost of living elsewhere has gone through the roof. So I still have to substitute what I did before for something cheaper, or give up something else because I just can't afford the cost of living.
No, and that's fair enough too. And I guess the other thing is that the election, Craig, is 5 months away, so not too many people are going to be remembering this budget in 5 months when they come to vote. Right. And what you're suggesting it is in the next 5 months that things, particularly in the housing front, are likely to deteriorate rather than get better.
Correct, and that's in the forecast that came out yesterday. So to combine the cost of funding a mortgage plus falling asset prices, and you get a letter in the mail around your new mortgage rate, I think that'll be a question in people's minds, and they'll be saying, well, how did this happen? Now, I won't tie it back to the budget, but it'll be a feature in your voting intentions for sure.
All right. Now, the next issue I was interested in also was the predictions that you've said. I'm sorry, but when I was in Parliament, we always used to take Treasury projections and predictions, Craig, with a grain of salt. They were always, you always regarded them as, well, to be perfectly massaged for whatever the message might be of the Minister of Finance. Do you think something along those lines has happened here, or do you really think that they're going, we really believe that this will happen, we're not going to have a recession, inflation's going to come down to 3%, which isn't bad when you compare where it is now, everything's going to be tickety-boo?
Well, I think that's the great question on two fronts. How can things change so dramatically inside 5 months from the last forecast? So the argument is net migration increased a lot, and tourism strong. Okay, that sounds like reasonable arguments to me, but that has implications for how the RBNZ sees the world. So if the recession's off the table, the Reserve Bank has to go harder because inflation expectations are not coming back to where the RBNZ wants them to be. The other question is, what if the Treasury's wrong, right?
That's more likely.
And, yeah, that's right. What if they're wrong, in which case we don't have this growth and we get a policy mistake, which is RBNZ hikes, but recession still comes. So what if they're wrong? Well, that would be an awful outcome. So there are the kind of risks around this that are clearly obvious, because these numbers that are bounced out around 1% GDP next year are the result of two very big numbers on it's components, and not just two, but several numbers that make up those relative GDP forecasts. So you're almost certainly not going to be correct at 1%. It's just a question of which way it goes, isn't it? But I discount the out years. I just looked in this case at 2024, June 2024 numbers, to have a degree of certainty, more certainty of those numbers. I discount the ones further out, because there'll be a new government in power in September, October, and they'll have different policy things perhaps, but they'll have to deal with the stuff underneath the water, the big part of the iceberg, which is our debt, the lack of policy reform that needs to be done to get to productivity outcomes that people genuinely want to happen in this country.
Yes, I mean, I guess, and that's the clear difference going to be between National and Labour at the next election. National say we're going to be better economic managers, but they're also promising to spend less. Obviously, I mean, you've got to get an appetite on government spending. You've got to, as you say, get that borrowing under control. Just politically, Craig, putting your politics hat on for a second, you're going to have to make some unpopular decisions already. One of them they've made, they're saying, well, those prescription fees are going to go back on straight away if we get elected. They're going to have to also nominate you, suggest other areas of the economy which they're going to cut.
Yeah, so this is the policy dilemma for the right of centre party. National is some incremental reversal which doesn't kind of scare middle New Zealand, but actually the fundamental issues are much deeper than an incremental change. So that's where David Seymour and ACT is trying to highlight to Kiwis the need for more fundamental reform, really having a good hard look at the public service, the delivery of government services, changes to the tax system, looking at ways of delivering services with better tools than the public sector currently uses. They're going for much deeper structural change. So it's a question of where the voters move to. And you can see where the two parties on that side are sort of moving. The Greens are probably deeply disappointed around lack of climate change movement in the budget. The failed ETS option has led to the need to top up the Climate Emergency Response Fund, and that hasn't delivered, a dividend for, Kiwis affected by the ETS. And Te Pāti Māori have got nothing that I can see from this budget. So you think about the politics of it, and Labor's definitely going to its traditional base. National has to take them on structural change in a way that doesn't scare the kind of conservative right. And the supporters of ACT are saying we've got to do something completely different here. We can't stay where we are. We have to change structurally, which is a much bigger question. And the voters have to make a decision, what sort of future do they want for themselves and their families.
Now, so what we should be looking forward to is the response of the Reserve Bank and of their Governor, Adrian Orr. When is that OCR announced? Did you say?
Yes, it's scheduled for the 24th of May, so that's next week.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Next month, also done.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's next.
So,
yeah, that's not very far away.
So they'll be looking at their forecasts now that the Treasury's fiscal impulse, the stimulation of the economy with that $4.8 billion of extra new operating spending. What does that mean? What does the debt profile mean, etc.? So they'll be picking it up and saying, okay, well, what we thought was a recession is now 1% growth. What we thought was X amount of fiscal stimulus is now larger. It's a different set of inputs to their process. So, as I said, I expect them straight throughout next week.
Well, you know how I like drama and confrontation, and I'm not particularly sensitive about trying to make people's feelings better or happy. But I'd have to say it's popcorn material next week, isn't it, with Adrian Orr and the Reserve Bank? Because if he does decide to raise the OCR by 25, you suggested possibly even 50 points, and the impact, as you say, upon floating mortgages, he's going to have a very unhappy Minister of Finance in the beehive, isn't he?
Well, he's got a 5-year contract, so he's got a job to do. He's there to get inflation back to 1 to 3%, and I think the Treasury pumped out what they call a kind of unemployment rate, which is sort of appropriate as a target around 4.25%. That's well above where unemployment is today. So Adrian's got room to move to raise rates without affecting, that unemployment kind of break-even rate, call it, and getting inflation back to 1 to 3. He's got room to move. So if he's going to deliver his mandate, he's got to get inflation expectations back in the tin. Otherwise, it makes it a lot harder for everyone. Inflation robs people. It's a thief in the night that takes away our savings. It means $1 today is worth 93 cents in a year's time with 7% inflation. It's just a thief. And it's important for all of us to get inflation back in the bag.
All right, and finally, because you've been part of that Wellington scene, what's the feeling in Wellington about this budget? What's the sort of take in the public sector that you've picked up over the last 24 hours? Is this something that makes them happy, unhappy, or it's just politics as usual and get on with it?
Well, there's no job losses in the public sector, is there? There's another amount of money being put together for new science and innovation hubs. $400 million is 2 or 3 new ones of those that'll be based in Wellington. People have got job security in Wellington. Nothing changes for them personally from an income perspective. It'd be a question of things like mortgage rates and house prices. For those in the public service who are looking for structural reform, they'll be disappointed. So we come back to this very blunt instrument called interest rates, which will be taking all the slack from the changes that were announced yesterday, and that will take some time to feed through. But I am sure when those notes come through from the banks that rates have risen again, there'll be a discussion among families around what we do here.
All right.
And that includes people in Wellington.
Craig, thank you so much for your analysis. I really appreciate that. And as usual, it is both erudite and informed. Good on you, mate. Have a very good weekend.
Thanks, Logan. Take care.
Okay, see you later. All right, this is Craig Stobo, probably one of New Zealand's leading business people, working in both the public and private sector. If you want to Google his CV, it's as impressive as it gets. But he has called it the iceberg budget. He says there's a bit going on the top. You can't get too upset about that. But God to God, he's saying, what's under bottom, that's what could sink the New Zealand economy, just like it did the Titanic, I suppose.